Boldwood presents The Good Wife, written by Gemma Rogers and read by Imogen Church. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Chloe. When I came out of the toilet into the washroom area, a curvaceous redhead stood at one of the porcelain sinks applying lipstick in the arched mirror. Her mouth frozen in a perfect O shape as she swept the wand over her Cupid's bow. A blood-red shade to match her gown, which looked as though it had been made especially for her. It clutched her small waist, yet skimmed the roundness of her behind, reminding me of Jessica Rabbit. Standing beside her, I ran a hand precariously over my sandy hair, straining to get it out of the clip it was pinched into. My husband, Tom, liked my hair up. He said it made me look classy and poised. I, however, did not. I had no desire to showcase the deep trivets of my collarbones in the black off-the-shoulder gown Tom had chosen for me to wear. My misgivings validated, as stood next to the ethereal beauty, I looked like a child in her mother's dress. The redhead did not speak, although she smiled politely. I went through the motions of washing my hands, unable to fully tear my gaze away. In her hand, she held a raffle ticket, the number 9 printed on a white stub. She glanced at it before tucking it into the plunging neckline of her dress. "What's the raffle for?" I asked, vaguely remembering Harry Poulter, the CEO and owner of Midian, handing tickets to the directors as they crossed the threshold of Glenthorne Manor, the location of the company dinner. The redhead tossed her hair back, glossy waves bouncing across milky shoulders as she let out a chuckle. "It's for me, darling," she said in a smooth Southern Irish accent, before slipping her lipstick into a gold clutch bag and checking herself once more in the mirror. "You?" I asked, lines creasing my forehead. Standing next to someone, yet having a conversation with their reflection in a mirror, as though it wasn't quite real. Her eyes ran the length of my body, leaving me exposed. "You've never been here before, have you?" I shook my head. It was Tom's first time, too, a quarterly event that only the directors of the technology company were invited to. Tom had recently been awarded a promotion to finance director, heralded as a rising star by Harry, the youngest in the history of Midian to make director at the tender age of 36, and the invitation was a big deal. A 3-course black-tie dinner at Harry's stately home in Turner's Hill, a leafy village in mid-Sussex around 15 minutes away from where we lived in Copthorne. I didn't understand what Midian did, creating computer chips or something, but they were climbing the ranks in their field. "Have a nice evening," the redhead said, smoothing down her hair one last time and leaving me alone in the washroom, heels clacking on the tiles as she went. I grimaced, still none the wiser about the raffle. What on earth did she mean? Bemused, I dried my hands on a plush towel and returned to Tom. There were 14 guests seated on a large oblong table in what could only be described as a ballroom. The walls were adorned with oak wooden panels, and along one side, floor-to-ceiling arched windows flooded the room with rays from the sinking sun. A huge chandelier hung from the centre of the ceiling, and in one corner stood an ebony grand piano. All of the directors were male, bar the human resources director, a stony-faced-looking woman in her 50s who had arrived unaccompanied, along with Graham Spector, the technology director. Everyone else had their polished wives seated beside them. I slid into my seat, trying to look as though I belonged, despite being the youngest person in the room, bar Tom, by at least 20 years. I'd followed the rules all night. Speak only when spoken to, don't slouch, chin up, shoulders back and hands in lap when not eating. Tom frowned as I laid my napkin across my lap, irritated I'd left my seat. But the champagne we'd been given on arrival had... "I'm sorry, there was a queue," I placated. He smiled tightly, resuming his conversation with the wife of Jim Robbins, the marketing director sitting to his right. I picked up my fork to finish the prime filet mignon, 3 mouthfuls left to have before I reached my limit of 10. I knew he'd be counting too. He always was. On the floor to my left, I noticed a ticket stub as I gathered in the skirt of my dress, which had caught on the chair. I reached down to collect it under the pretense I was adjusting my hem. It was the number 9, a match to the woman's in the bathroom. Could it be the winning ticket? No one had mentioned the raffle or what prizes were available to be won. However, Tom had told me Harry was notorious for his grand gestures, so I assumed whatever it was would be significant. Next to me, Graham, a bulbous man with a raucous laugh which made me jump, hadn't noticed his ticket was missing. With the stub tucked into my clammy palm, I took a sip of wine, trying to locate Tom's ticket, spying it wedged underneath his glass. Deep in conversation, he didn't notice when I swapped the two. They must have been handed out when I was in the bathroom. Was I supposed to get one? Or was it 1 ticket per couple? Surveying the length of the table, I spied the mysterious redhead sat next to Harry Poulter. She threw her head back and laughed at something he'd whispered into her ear. Tom had told me Harry was widowed, but I couldn't imagine she'd be his latest squeeze. He was knocking on 60 with an enormous overhanging belly, a receding hairline and rosacea. I knew some women were attracted to powerful, not to mention rich men, but instinct told me she wasn't one of those. "Are you enjoying your steak, darling?" Tom asked, interrupting my thoughts. "It's delicious," I said automatically, despite it being too rare for my taste. Red liquid pooled in the corner of my plate every time I carved a slice. "Don't fill yourself up too much. You've got another course to go yet." He smiled, although it didn't reach his eyes. His smiles never did anymore. Acquiescing, I laid my fork down, resting my hands in my lap, cheeks burning. I watched his gaze flitter over to where his lips parting. He'd always had a thing for redheads, unable to stop himself from commenting if there was an actress on the television, and she was exquisite. Our plates were collected a few minutes later, and dessert was served, a sliver of dark chocolate cheesecake. Decadence delivered on a tiny plate as the guests moaned in pleasure. I took a small bite, the first of the 10 I was allowed, filling sticking to the roof of my mouth. It was a struggle to swallow, and I dabbed at my lips with the ivory napkin, surveying the other guests and catching snippets of conversation where I could. Tom had barely spoken to me all night, but I knew he was networking, trying to establish his place amongst the directors. I watched as he fiddled with his cufflinks, a sign of boredom as he listened to the wife of the marketing director I'd not yet been introduced to. She was in her mid-50s with bird-like features. Each finger had a ring on it, each wrist multiple bangles, jangling as she told Tom about a recent visit to the south of France. Heads turned to the sound of a chinking glass. Harry Poulter pushed his chair back, his stomach straining against the buttons of his white dress shirt.
Thank you, my wonderful guests, for your presence this evening. Now, as is tradition, the directors will retire to the drawing room for a glass or two of bourbon. Ladies, feel free to indulge in the bar set up in the library. We have an excellent mixologist who can make anything you desire.
Everyone began to stand, chairs scraped backwards on the parquet floor. Come on, dear, let's get you a Bellini. The woman whom my husband had been chatting to throughout dinner appeared at my side and nudged my arm as the others vacated the room, men in one direction, the wives in another. Tom gave me a nod before following the crowd. The ticket stub I'd swapped no longer under his glass, but now in his hand. I stood on shaky legs, anxiety unfurling at the prospect of small talk with strangers. I'm Anita, the woman introduced herself, linking her arm through mine and leading me towards the exit. Chapter 2. Tom.
Graham clapped me on the back as we entered. Rows of books stood on mahogany shelves at the rear of the room where Harry was delving into an ornate drinks cabinet. It felt oppressive inside, but perhaps it was the company rather than the decor. The walls were papered with an intricate burgundy pattern, an attempt at coziness, but rather it seemed to close in on its inhabitants. A seating area of navy settees and armchairs were positioned around a teardrop coffee table, and a couple of directors had already claimed their perches. Now for the good stuff, Graham said, heading straight towards Harry, who was pouring bourbon from a large decanter. I followed. Of course, Tonya, no problem. Have a lovely evening, Harry said to the HR director, who appeared to be making her excuses to leave. She always disappears early. Not very sociable, that one, Graham whispered into my ear as she swept past. It was clear she was outnumbered, the only female on the board, although I was sure Harry had deemed her attendance at these dinners were compulsory. She likely couldn't wait to escape the male camaraderie. As Harry handed out glasses of bourbon to those without a drink, Graham told me Tonya was unmarried, career-focused, and not a woman to be trifled with. I was half listening when Harry's redhead slipped inside the room, catching my eye, and took her place next to him. I knew he wasn't married. Was she his date for the evening? How had he managed to pull her? Unable to take my eyes off the beauty, Graham's voice faded out when she looked right at me, her full lips forming a smile. I jolted when Harry clapped his hands together and cleared his throat. Welcome, gentlemen. I do hope you enjoyed dinner. Let's raise a glass to another successful quarter. Everyone lifted their glass, amber liquid swirling as we all took a sip. Now it's raffle time. I watched as the 6 other directors looked on eagerly. Harry held court with complete focus from his team. Fishing in my pocket for my ticket, I frowned at the number. Didn't Harry give me number 4 when we arrived? How did I end up with number 9? "The lovely Savannah here." He gestured towards her as she held out the ticket stub before loudly pronouncing, "The number 9." There was a low murmur around the room as the directors checked their tickets. My ears tinged pink on discovering I'd won. Savannah scanned our faces, awaiting the winner. "Here," I said, waving the ticket. "Ha! Young Tom Beswick!" Harry waved me forward as all eyes fell upon me. When I reached him, he shook my hand and passed me an envelope which I knew from Graham contained a cheque. "Excellent, excellent. Congratulations, Tom. I'll leave you in Savannah's capable hands." He motioned towards Savannah before focusing back on the room. "Right, gentlemen, who's up for some poker?" My heart hammered in my chest as Savannah slipped her arm through mine and guided me towards the door. "Lucky bastard," Graham muttered under his breath as we passed, grimacing at his raffle ticket. How much was the cheque for? Graham was hardly on the breadline, and his reaction seemed a little sour, unless there was more to winning than I thought. "Where are we going?" I said quietly, leaning in toward Savannah and breathing in her sugary perfume. A smile danced on her lips, and she squeezed my arm conspiratorially. "You'll see." Chapter 3. Chloe. "So, what do you do?" Anita prompted, passing me a Bellini from the bar. Tiny age spots peppered the back of her hand. Her sparrow-like arms were slender, skin crepey from too much time spent in the sun. "Chloe," I inserted for her. "And, well, I used to be an editor, but now I guess I'm in between jobs." "I haven't worked for years. Some of the wives do. Marcus's wife Jill, she's a bereavement counsellor, and there's Anton's wife Victoria, she works at a rescue centre for abandoned dogs." Anita paused briefly to adjust the strap of her navy dress. "You're Jim's wife?" I asked, assuming, as she was seated next to him, Jim had been one of the directors We'd smiled to one another as we found our place cards, but Tom hadn't bothered to introduce us. He'd been too busy summoning the waiter for a glass of Merlot. "Yes, we've been married for 30 years. Heaven knows why I still put up with him." She laughed dryly, her crow's feet wrinkling, powder sitting in the lines. "When is the raffle?" I sipped on my cocktail, hoping my tone sounded nonchalant. The drink was far too strong. Anita didn't bat an eyelid before answering. "It happens in the drawing room after dinner, so Jim tells me. They do the raffle, drink and play poker for an hour or so, leaving us wives to scheme in here." "What do they win?" "Usually it's a cheque, a bonus if you like. If Tom wins, make sure he spends it all on you." Anita clinked her glass against mine. "I bumped into a redhead in the washroom. I don't see her in here," I said, turning to look at the women in the room. "Oh, that's Savannah. She's Harry's latest, but she doesn't socialise with us," Anita said disdainfully, her nose wrinkling.
I wanted to press for more information, but before I could, a voice came from behind.
"Hello, newbie."
A gaggle of 4 women surrounded us, all with perfectly coiffed hair and floor-skimming dresses of silk and satin. My dress was black satin, simple, classic, Tom had said, but I still felt underdressed. "Hello," I replied, heat rising in my cheeks.
"It's lovely to meet you. You're Tom's wife, yes?"
"Chloe," I replied, not sure whether to offer my hand to shake or curtsy. Instead, I did neither, clutching my Bellini close as though it might ward them off.
"I see you've met Anita. I'm Jill."
The brunette with lipstick on her teeth planted a hand to her chest.
"And this is Hannah, Sarah, and Victoria,"
gesturing to the women next to her. "Victoria is Anton's wife, works at the dog shelter," Anita interjected. Victoria smiled warmly. She looked the most approachable. "Someone has to look after those poor mutts," she said. I smiled back and nodded politely at all of them. "I'm going to struggle to remember everyone's names," I admitted, knowing my...
"Oh, that's all right. You'll soon get to know us."
Hannah cackled, reminding me of the witches hunched over the cauldron in Macbeth.
"It's lovely to have some young blood,"
Jill said, emphasising the word young.
"How old are you, dear?"
26, I said, trying to make my voice sound confident. "How long have you and Tom been married?" Sarah asked. 3 years? It was starting to feel like the Spanish Inquisition.
"Oh, still in the honeymoon phase. Remember that, ladies?"
Jill laughed as they all nodded. I thumbed the band of my wedding ring, grateful when Anita came to my rescue and interjected, complimenting Sarah on her necklace. The cocktails flowed and conversation quickly moved on to gossip. Who was up for the chop at Midian, who had floored the management team with their sales figures for the first quarter, and which director was sleeping with their personal assistant. By the time the men came to collect their wives, my head was spinning from the constant chatter. "You must give me your number," Anita said, as Jim sidled up beside her, bringing with him the smell of cigar smoke. "We have a WhatsApp group. I'll add you to it." I frowned as I imagined what those messages might include. The latest Mulberry handbag on sale, or notification of a charity auction we all had to contribute to. No, thank you. "I don't have a phone." I bit my lip, wishing the ground would open up. "Well, I do, but it's a really old handset. It doesn't have any apps."
"Hello, you,"
Tom appeared, pressing his lips to the side of my head, arm curling around my waist. I turned to look at him. His skin glowed, and he smelt freshly washed, woody, not his usual signature aftershave. Had he showered?
"For goodness sake, Tom, get your wife a proper phone. How am I supposed to WhatsApp her otherwise?"
Anita chimed with an exaggerated eye roll.
"Chloe hates technology. But perhaps between us we can work on her."
He leaned in conspiratorially. A charming smile danced on his lips. Anita practically melted, and I swallowed the rock in my throat. Hate technology. But I hadn't had a smartphone for months, not since it was knocked into a sink full of dirty water. I'd been using an ancient Nokia handset of Tom's ever since, but of course it wasn't something I could admit in present company. We said our goodbyes and headed out to the sweeping gravel drive. where a herd of black Mercedes waited to collect us and escort us home. Tom sighed as he got into the back with me, his legs splayed wide. The driver hadn't even left the grounds before he was unbuttoning his collar, sliding off the bow tie and sinking back into the leather seat.
Well, that was fun.
It was, I replied, although now I was keen to get home and out of this dress. Tom took my hand and interlaced his fingers through mine.
I won the raffle,
he said, digging out a cheque signed by Harry for £5,000. Congratulations, I replied, my brow furrowing in confusion as I thought back to my conversation with the redhead. I met Savannah in the bathroom. She picks the winner, doesn't she? Tom cleared his throat, swallowing. His Adam's apple bobbed, and I got the impression he was choosing his words carefully.
Yes, she pulls the number out. In the drawing room.
He looked uncomfortable and began fidgeting with his watch as I studied him. There was more to it, I was sure, remembering his appearance in the library, the scent that clung to him, not his usual signature aftershave.
You did well tonight. They were impressed,
he said, filling the silence. I flushed, welcoming his praise. Thank you. Anita was friendly. Tom's face darkened slightly.
Yes. About the phone. Perhaps we can look at getting you something.
I tried not to let the excitement bubble on my face. Tom kept saying he was going to replace the rubbish handset I was using, but whenever I asked, he always offered his, expecting me to use it in front of him and then hand it back rather than getting me something more permanent. Maybe he'd relent if it meant getting pally with the directors' wives. Those circles, he would. Back home, as I got undressed in the bathroom and removed my makeup, I was deliberately slow, still trying to process the night's events. Positive that a $5,000 cheque wasn't the only thing that my husband had won. Did the wives know it wasn't only money up for grabs in the raffle, but potentially something sordid? Surely they wouldn't tolerate that. When I emerged, as I'd hoped, Tom was already fast asleep, snoring quietly. I slipped into bed, trying not to disturb him, relieved I wouldn't have to perform. Perhaps Savannah had exhausted him. Surprised to find I wasn't at all jealous. In fact, I should thank her for saving me the trouble. My marriage to Tom was no longer a happy one. We'd met when I was 23, a whirlwind romance after he'd approached me in a bookshop. I was perusing the aisles, checking out similar titles to the book I'd been given to edit. Back then, I was the assistant to the editor at Oakley Publishing House, a small press in South London. Tom was in his lunch hour and asked me for suggestions on what hardback to gift his mother, admitting he'd only read one fiction book in his life, and it was Stephen King. He was charming, a little flirtatious, and I was bowled over from the outset. He had a strong jaw and eyes the colour of dark pools. 10 years older than me, Tom knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to ask. We'd had dinner that night, where he'd promised me the world. And I'd believed him. 3 months later, we'd flown to the Seychelles for a holiday that ended up being an intimate beach wedding neither of our parents attended. Within 6 months, we'd moved out of his flat and he'd bought a house 30 miles away in a quiet Sussex village, which meant the visits to my friends and parents became less frequent. Tom always had plans, making arrangements to fill up my time, leaving little for anyone else. How easy it had been for him to slowly isolate me. I'd been so head over heels. I'd missed all the warning signs, believing it was love which made him want to spend, and no one else mattered. When I'd finally cottoned on to it not being about love at all, but about control, it was already too late. Chapter 4. Tom.
I woke on Sunday feeling energized. My time with Savannah had been worth it, and Chloe was none the wiser as to what I'd been up to while she'd been drinking with the wives. I'd pulled out the cheque written by Harry Poulter for £5,000, brandishing it as my raffle prize, but she took little interest. My wife was getting harder to please nowadays. Didn't she realize how hard I worked to keep us in the life we'd become accustomed to? A little playtime with Savannah was hardly a crime. In fact, for me, it was the unexpected highlight of the evening. Graham, the technology director, had given an indication of how the evening would go. The 3-course meal, the cheque, although he hadn't mentioned Savannah's involvement in the raffle. He'd taken me under his wing as soon as the promotion had been made public, helping smooth the transition from financial controller to director. I'd joined Midian 4 years ago in a finance role, training clients in invoicing and budgeting software initially before moving into the controller role, intent on climbing the ladder as fast as I could. The promotion to director was a big deal and came with more benefits, namely a company-leased Range Rover and a larger salary. Only the directors were invited to the quarterly dinners, another perk of the management team. Someone would win a monetary bonus in the raffle and, as long as they were discreet, the option of an hour with Savannah. A sweetener on top of the bonus, she'd enlightened me, as we'd climbed the stairs of Glenthorne Manor. I couldn't believe my ears. But the stirring in my groin as we descended had been hard to ignore. Did anyone refuse? Would it be frowned upon to do so? I'd wanted to ask the questions whirling around my head, but could barely speak as she directed me towards one of the bedrooms. Savannah was ravishing. And despite having never cheated on my wife before, debating whether to go through with it lasted around 10 seconds, as I watched. Chloe would never know, and Savannah was too sexy to refuse. Curves in all the right places, and downright filthy it had turned out. I couldn't deny she'd left me wanting more, slipping her business card into my hand before I'd left the bedroom. It had all been over embarrassingly quickly, caught up in the moment, although I'd told her I had to get back to my unsuspecting wife. An escort? Who'd have thought it? Never before would I have entertained the idea of something so smutty. Savannah was a prostitute, albeit a high-class one, and paying for sex was something for losers as far as I'd been concerned. Afterwards, as I looked around the drawing room necking another bourbon, my stomach hardened at how many of us she'd likely entertained. Was Graham one of them? It seemed unlikely, given his reaction to my win, especially as he'd omitted to tell me the part Savannah played in the raffle. I'd expected knowing looks and claps on the back, but no one batted an eyelid. Harry didn't mention it either. Had they all been in my position before? Was I likely to be the office gossip for the next month? Or was Savannah right? Was discretion the one rule everyone stuck to? If any of the wives discovered what Harry was offering, or even HR for that matter, it would be catastrophic. The sort of headlines newspapers would pay a fortune for. So, what happened at Glenthorne Manor stayed at Glenthorne Manor. I could get on board with that, especially as Savannah had switched on a desire I didn't know existed, and I knew I'd have to see her again. Chloe was quiet over breakfast on Sunday morning as I laid out our plans for the day, ignoring the twinges of guilt that hit every time she looked at me. My parents were visiting for lunch, so I asked her to get the place ready whilst I picked up a leg of lamb from the supermarket. I couldn't deny Chloe was an excellent wife, loyal and well-trained. She kept the house spotless, as I'd come to expect, and had learnt a lot on the cooking course I'd paid for. Once I'd convinced her I needed her at home, not spending all hours fawning over silly manuscripts, I intended to earn the money, and she would look after everything else. I had expected her to have a strong, healthy boy to chase around, but it was yet to happen. Still, she was young, and there was plenty of time for that. Chloe had been sweet and innocent when I met her, and I knew straight away she was the perfectly pliable girl I could mould. My parents had reluctantly agreed when I told them I was going to marry Chloe, despite her not being privately educated like I'd been. My mother had drummed it into me that no woman would really ever be good enough. She'd put me on a pedestal since I was a boy, expecting perfection and nothing less. She'd hated every girlfriend I'd brought home, finding fault with them all. But to be fair, they had needed work, unlike Chloe, who had been easy to mould. It pleased me that when they came to visit, Chloe was the flawless hostess, even if occasionally, like this morning, she still needed pointers. "Those aren't the clothes I laid out for you." I'd frowned over the top of the newspaper when Chloe had entered the kitchen in leggings and a t-shirt.
"I can't clean in those clothes, they'll be ruined," she'd replied, her snippy tone grating.
"Of course," I'd smiled tightly, not willing to enter into an argument when my parents would be arriving in a matter of hours, and if I was honest, my head was still consumed by Savannah. "Right, I best get down to the supermarket and get some meat," I announced after breakfast, getting up to slip on my shoes. The sun outside was glorious, perfect for an afternoon walk by the stream later on. Collecting my keys and phone, I presented my cheek to Chloe for a kiss before heading out of the door, keen to be alone, so I could message Savannah.
Chapter 5. Chloe. My shoulders loosened as soon as the door clicked shut, as if all the tension had left my body without Tom's presence stifling me. Donning rubber gloves, I scrubbed the kitchen until my arms ached. Tom expected perfection and nothing less. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of running his finger across a dirty surface and raising an eyebrow at me. I moved from room to room with the mop and duster, plumping cushions and lighting scented candles. How had my life? I missed the hustle and bustle of working in London, the thrill of reading a manuscript by a new author I knew deep down in my gut would be a hit. I had loved my job,
and was still finding it hard to process how it ended 2.5 years ago. How the edited manuscript of a successful author had found its way off my computer to an internet streaming site long before publication day. I'd been forced to resign soon after.
Tom was involved. I was sure of it.
When his gentle suggestions I should leave my job for a more homely life were rebuffed,
he'd found a way to sabotage my career.
I'd had my suspicions. He was only too pleased to have me at home playing the dutiful wife. I should have left, packed my things and dropped my wedding band on the table on my way out, but I had no one to turn to. Nowhere to go, thanks to Tom. My relationship with my mum was already fractious due to the speed with which I'd got married. Dad was laid back about the whole thing, but Mum was heartbroken and had warned me I was making a mistake. She'd never warmed to Tom and thought he was smug. The wedding was the breaking point. I was their only child, yet my parents had not even been invited to the wedding. Tom had insisted he'd arranged it all as a romantic surprise, whereas I'd thought it was just a holiday. But now I saw it for what it was. A rushed wedding with no chance to back out. One that didn't allow my parents to be involved or object to. My friends had pulled away too, or inadvertently I'd pushed them away, my social circle dissolving into Tom's needs. They were tired of my unavailability, eventually giving up and ceasing contact altogether. They'd found Tom rude and aloof, too full of his own self-importance. He'd made no effort with them on the few occasions we'd socialised, on purpose, I'd later realised, so he could have me all to himself. He loved me too much to share me. Showering me with expensive gifts, I could have anything I wanted, except for independence. Tom wanted me to rely on him for everything, and I was so blinded by love, I had no idea. It became too late to make my escape. I was in too deep. I couldn't bear to turn up at my mum's door with only the clothes on my back and an apology for getting caught up in it all after how much I'd upset her. I'd been so sure I hadn't made a mistake, like she'd said. Although I knew she'd never turn me away, I couldn't bear the humiliation of arriving on her doorstep, asking if I could move back in, knowing she'd been right all along. It had been easier to stay, to make the best of it. I'd never felt entirely trapped until the day Tom coldly told me the only way out of our marriage was if I was in a box. He hadn't physically hurt me, not past a smattering of bruises on my upper arms from being gripped too tightly, but in the past couple of years he'd slowly sucked the air from my lungs. It was easier to be compliant, keep him happy and go along with his plans and rules. I'd become paralysed at the thought of making decisions for myself, to live without him handling everything. I was used to Tom telling me what to do, despite knowing it wasn't a normal, healthy relationship. He chose the clothes I wore each day. At first I thought it was romantic, but Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, it wasn't. He dressed me like a doll, took me for haircuts and manicures when I needed them, bought all my clothes and accessories. My own once bohemian style entirely replaced with one he preferred. A classy, well-groomed lady. He controlled the finances too, checking bank statements to see what I'd spent with his prior approval. Tom chose what we did at the weekends, where we went on holiday, and improvements we made to our home. I didn't even have a driving licence or a car. The only thing I'd found to give me a relief was running. Now I ran most weekdays while Tom worked, the only time I felt free. He used to say he loved my athletic body and the stamina I had in the bedroom. As long as I took my phone with me so I could answer when he rang, he was happy. But he didn't say it anymore, although he didn't stop me running. To say it would be an understatement. He liked things just so. Food placed in cupboards with the labels facing outwards, books on the shelf arranged by colour, then size. His clothes had to be folded a certain way, hung in a particular order in the wardrobe. Everything had to be neat and tidy, but most of all, precise. In the early days of our marriage, he'd given me a lesson on silver service and the positioning of the cutlery. We'd only been having a lasagna. His demands were constant, but none more so than when the rule of 10 became law.
I've heard having only 10 mouthfuls of any meal is the optimum amount of food to digest at any one time,
he said over dinner one night.
You should try it.
It was a request couched as a suggestion, and I felt I had no choice. So I did. 10 mouthfuls of chicken casserole, which sounded like a lot, but it wasn't until you loaded your fork up, which Tom frowned upon. I'd assumed he was trying to help me. I'd gained a few pounds. The honeymoon period had worn off before I began running, but I was happy and keen to make Tom happy too. It soon became a rule at every meal. Even if I was eating a biscuit, it had to be divided into 10 bites. Mindful eating, he'd called it, doing it with me the first few times before the enthusiasm wore off. Like a disease, it spread to other areas of my life. I had 10 minutes in the shower, 10 minutes to do my hair, 10 minutes to do my makeup, every tiny thing broken down into slots of 10 minutes. It had started as a joke, but quickly became a way of life. When I no longer had a job, during the weekdays when Tom was at work, once the house was spotless and all chores taken care of, if I didn't run, I went for a walk, if only to find a random stranger for some interaction on a park bench. I was lonely and missed my friends, my work colleagues. I missed aimless conversations and banter. On one such day, while I was out, Tom called and asked me to get home in 10 minutes because he had a package being delivered. That sunny day, I'd walked 3 miles out of the village, and despite jogging home, I'd missed the courier. Tom was incandescent, and a new rule was brought into play. At any one time, I couldn't be any further than 10 minutes away from the house. It shrank my world even further. I could go to the local shops and the park, visit the stream, but that was it. Any further outside the circle, I risked not being able to get back in time. I trained harder, pushing myself to go further, move quicker. Tom called numerous times whilst I was out, urging me back for one ridiculous reason or another, yet I always made it back in time. It was a tiny win, but I'd found a sort of escape. the way to push the boundaries of my world. Today, however, there would be no running. I had to be the queen of entertaining my in-laws, the perfect wife Tom could show off to his adoring mother. I would have to smile sweetly and ignore her veiled attempts to pick holes in everything, as was her way. Hopefully, it would be one of the last times I'd have to go through with it. Because maybe just after last night, I had a plan. Chapter 6. Savannah. I was studying at the dining table when my phone rang. Being an escort wasn't exactly a 9-to-6 job, so whenever I was free, I had my head in a textbook. It was my last year of university, working towards a bachelor's degree in law and trying to make sense of the legislation I needed to quote for a paper due to be submitted, but I couldn't ignore the prospect of making money. "Hello?" I purred into the phone as I answered a number I didn't recognize. "Savannah, it's Tom from Friday night." I let the silence stretch out. I'd been anticipating his call. "The Midian dinner at Glenthorne Manor," he continued. I could hear the desperation in his voice, to be remembered, as if any of them stood out. They were all the same, massive egos that required stroking. "Tom, hi. How are you?" I said warmly, folding the page of the textbook so I wouldn't lose where I was. "Thank you. How about you?" "Fabulous. What can I do for you?" It wasn't really a question. I knew why he was calling, his satisfied smile on Friday night popping into the forefront of my mind. "I hoped you might have availability this week." "Let me check my diary and I'll get back to you. On this number?" "Yes, could you send a text, if possible?" "Of course," I chuckled. "I'll be discreet." My voice silky smooth. "Thank you." I heard the anticipation in his voice before he hung up, the sigh of relief I wouldn't expose him whilst he played happy families at home. I eased back into my chair, picking up the textbook. I'd check my diary in a while, certain I could make a space available. Tom had no idea of the rate yet, and I was sure it would make him gasp, but I was also sure he wouldn't refuse. I enjoyed the thrill of his wanting, the power I held. Men would lie and deceive and take risks to spend time with me. It made me feel beautiful and sexy to know I was desired more than the women they lived with or were married to. But it was their money I coveted. Once I had my degree, I would be closing my appointment book for good. Introducing myself to Harry Poulter at the bar of his local golf club a year ago had paved the way for many of the bookings I had now, and I owed a lot to him, which was why I was only too happy to attend his quarterly dinners. I got paid $5,000 for my evening, which included my services for him and one other winner. The key to success was to be everything their girlfriend or wife were not, so when they were meeting each other for a liquid lunch or organizing charity functions on top of studying, I had to fit in gym sessions, making sure my arse didn't wobble when I walked. While they were knee-deep in housework, creating the perfect home for their workaholic husbands, or changing the nappies of their offspring, I was getting waxed, plucked, and manicured. That's all it was, an illusion.
It helped if you enjoyed sex, which I did, obviously not with old, overweight men, although they were, but I could fake it as well as the rest of them. The goal was to get my degree and find a firm where I could practice. It was why I'd left Ireland and moved to England at 19, desperate to put some space between me and my overbearing mother and enjoy a little freedom. My father was a lush, drinking his wages away before my mother could pay the rent. Money had been tight, and me and my brother Craig had been signed up to work as soon as we were old enough to help put food on the table. It wasn't the life I'd envisaged, and I knew if I didn't leave, I'd be stuck in the same cycle my mother had found herself in. When I'd arrived in the country, I'd worked 18-hour days and low-paid jobs to scrape together enough money for a room in shared accommodation, existing on packets of noodles and crisp sandwiches, whilst dreaming of bettering myself. Eventually, I was accepted by the University of Brighton and offered a placement on a foundation degree in law. But even with student loans and bar work, there was hardly anything to live on. That's when I met Natasha in a bar. I'd been serving her and her companion all night, catching snippets of a conversation that piqued my interest. When her friend stepped outside to take a work call, we'd got chatting, and I'd asked her outright if she was soliciting for sex. She'd laughed and told me she was an escort, and men paid for her company, not for sex. Even that idea was abhorrent at first, until she told me how much money she was making. Like me, she was trying to pay her way through university. We bonded over the intensity of student life, the overwhelming amount of information one had to absorb, and having barely enough to make ends meet. That was until she'd started escorting. Natasha and I became friends, sometimes studying together and letting loose at the end of a tough week. Being a few years older, she took me under her wing, giving me a crash course in escorting. Sure, I'd be a natural with my Celtic looks and bubbly personality. She passed a few easy clients over to me when she couldn't fit them in, and it wasn't long before I was raking in enough money to give up my bar job, allowing more time for study. When I met Harry, he introduced me to a more lucrative stream of income, although I kept a few of my regular clients on. Most of the men who secured my service and had given in to the middle-aged spread, so Tom was a welcome surprise. I couldn't deny I found him attractive. He had broad shoulders, a smattering of dark hair on his toned chest, a shapely jawline, and midnight blue eyes, which were particularly striking. He was clean, eager, and, with a little coaxing, concise about what he wanted from our time together. I'd pulled out a few of my most popular tricks, which may have worked a little too well given the speed at which he finished, but I was sure he was satisfied with his bonus. He must have been, to call and want to book another session with me so soon. It looked as though I had a new client to add to my books.
Chapter 7. Chloe. Tom's parents, true to form, arrived precisely at midday. The apple never did fall far from the tree. I had the lamb already in the oven, and we sat in the garden, enjoying the warmth of the June sun with a pot of tea and biscuits.
"Oh, Thomas, you really must prune that blossom tree,"
Gwen said, her lips pursing at the drooping branches and scattering of pink blossom across the manicured lawn. I wanted to tell her the smattering of colour was pretty, but I kept quiet. Tom would think it rude for me to disagree with our guests. More so, it would be a cardinal sin to quarrel with his mother.
"I'll get someone in, Mother," Tom sighed. "Anyway, how was your week?"
He tried to change the subject. Gwen launched into a tirade about the opticians and the ghastly service she'd received from someone who didn't even look old enough to be employed, let alone a qualified optometrist. It was the same pattern at every visit. Gwen could always find something to complain about. "I'm just going to check on the lamb," I said when she'd paused for breath. Tom smiled and patted my behind as I got up.
"There's a good girl,"
he said, as though I was a pedigree racehorse. I smiled sweetly over gritted teeth and retreated to the safe haven of the kitchen. Tom had his parents over usually once a month for Sunday lunch, and they were long and laborious for both of us, although I'd only made the mistake of criticising his mother once. I'd spent all afternoon clearing up the smashed bottle of red wine from the kitchen floor, trying to bleach the red out of the cream grout until my hands stung. Today, thankfully, lunch was well received, with only one snipe about how my parsnips could have been crispier. Charles, Tom's dad, used the walk by the stream afterwards to berate Tom about how thin I had become. He usually kept his opinions to himself, drowned out by Gwen, who was as overbearing with her husband as she was with her son. Tom had got his domineering ways from his mother, yet he seemed desperate to please her as much as he was eager to be liberated from her grip.
"She runs, Dad. She's as fit as a fiddle." "Yes, well, the girl could do with more childbearing hips,"
he snapped back as I strode ahead of them, pretending not to hear. When they finally left, Tom took a large whiskey into the lounge, and I began loading the dishwasher, glad to be alone with my thoughts. Before they'd arrived, he'd been in a good mood, and I no doubt had Savannah to thank for that. Now he was likely contemplating his failure to impregnate me. The Besicks were desperate for a grandchild. But when Tom had decided I should come off the pill a few months ago, I'd booked an appointment in secret at the doctor's to get a coil fitted. I'd known a few months after we'd moved into the cottage, when Tom had begun to change, that I didn't want to be the mother of his children, hence the coil. But I also knew I needed an escape plan. Tom wouldn't let me go easily. Marriage, as far as he was concerned, wasn't something he would fail at. Finding myself isolated, with no job, no income, and no friends, I was trapped. But now Savannah had materialised like a gift. I just had to find a way to contact her. Later that evening, I joined Tom in the lounge and we watched a police drama on the television. I was desperate to put on some comfier clothes. The lemon-checked capri pants Tom had chosen kept riding up. He stroked my hair, his words slurring from the amount of whiskey he'd consumed.
"I think you need a trim, my love. Perhaps some highlights."